Moonlight falling across a dune, a single set of footprints glows in the sand while impossible eyes seem to watch from the ground. The wind in this country has a voice of its own. It slides like a thinking thing across the plains of the Namib, scooping sand from the bones of yesterday and tracing the memory of footsteps into new ridges every season. Where the sky meets the parched earth, the world moves with a patient cruelty, shadows lengthen into labyrinths and night rearranges the ordinary into unfamiliar shapes. Among the people who have lived close to this surface for longer than the compass remembers, there are stories that are not just entertainment but maps and warnings in one. The Aigamuxa has always been one such story. For the Khoikhoi, who read weather and water and footfall as any map, the Aigamuxa was not merely a monster, it was a lesson dressed in terror. It is said to be a tall, gaunt thing that walks like a reed, skin taut and dry, movement silent until it chooses not to be. Its most terrifying detail is simple enough to name and impossible to unsee. Where a normal creature has eyes set in a face, the Aigamuxa's eyes open on the soles of its feet. It sees the world beneath it, sees the prints in the sand, sees the tremor of breath near a sleeping fire, and it finds what the dark has hidden. To be cautious in the desert is to live, and to ignore the lessons encoded in the language of myth is to become part of its study. In the telling and retelling of the Aigamuxa, generations preserved knowledge about travel, campcraft, and respect for the invisible intelligence of the land. This retelling reaches into that thick weave of landscape and lore. It imagines tracks in moonlight and the weight of an animal's stare from a place no one expects, while trying to keep the heart of the story truthful to the people who first told it. The wind still listens when elders speak and the sand keeps its own ledger. Somewhere in those ledgers, the Aigamuxa watches with patient souls for the careless and the unmindful, and reminds anyone who will listen that every place has eyes, some in plain sight, others right where you set your feet. Origins: how a landscape gave birth to a monster. The first time a people invent a thing, it is usually to explain what they cannot otherwise describe. The Khoikhoi, whose lives were braided with grazing cycles, migratory birds and the slow logic of desert water, named things not just for the present but for what they needed to remember. A nameless creature becomes a caution when it can embody multiple dangers at once: the suddenness of hunger, the hidden peril of night, the mistake of trusting still air. The Aigamuxa grew from those needs. In the flat country of wind and stone, a child who travels alone will be sniffed by predators and dazzled by mirages. Night is a secret keeper, feet are fragile tools that leave maps on sand. What terror, then, could better combine the intelligence of the land and the danger of unseen pursuit than a hunter whose eyes are closest to the ground? Imagine, for a moment, a hunter whose vision is always on the prints, forever reading the stories they tell. A bent blade of reed that follows confidence and fear in equal measure, a thing that reads the human heartbeat by the impressions in sand. That image is not pure invention but a compressed survival manual. The Aigamuxa's eyes on its feet are a poetic way of warning travelers not to turn their backs on the footprints left behind. Every track can lead to an ambush. This is practical folk wisdom knitted into a striking picture. The horror it evokes enforces memory. An elder gesturing toward footprints as the last day light fades, an impossible footprint marks the story's origin. The landscape itself adds details that make the legend feel inevitable. The Namib Desert is an ecology of extremes. Ephemeral rivers appear with brief rain, then vanish into braided channels that the land remembers long after the water is gone. The Kalahari edges hold grasses that whisper about distance and direction, while rocky kopjes cast long, cool shadows at day's end. In such a place, a person must learn to read the ground like a book. Wind-blown sand erases tracks in hours. An animal that travels by moonlight can approach without a human noticing if the listener does not understand how the wind is speaking. The Aigamuxa legend grew like a topographical feature, its contours shaped by real hazards. To elders, telling the story to a child was the same as giving them a compass and a rulebook for night travel. They learned to tie their clothes to poles, to sleep with shoes near the body, to build low ember fires rather than bright flames that attract attention. These are the kinds of instructions encoded in the monstrous detail of the Aigamuxa. But as with all living stories, the Aigamuxa is also a metaphor for the inscrutable decisions elders had to pass down. In survival terms, seeing the world from the ground up becomes an elegant admonition against assuming safety just because the sky is clear. In moral terms, the eyes on feet detail suggests a kind of attention to small, often ignored acts that can change the course of a life. A child leaving an ember too close to dried grass, a shepherd straying into a nightscape without a companion, a hunter returning late and sleeping with his back turned. The eyes that peer from a soul are less about physical anatomy than about perspective. They are the perspective of the land itself, patient, indifferent, watchful. The Aigamuxa is the desert's way of saying, the land sees you even when you cannot see it. The myth's anatomy is purposely uncanny. The body of the Aigamuxa is seldom described in minute zoological detail. Instead, storytellers linger on sensations, the rustle like a dry reed, the faint musk scent, the impression in sand that seems too large to match the silhouette glimpsed in moonlight. Elders speak of elongated limbs that fold like an insect's, a narrow jaw that tilts as if listening to the ground, and, always, the eyes born where feet should not. Such images create a cognitive dissonance that makes listeners physically adjust, to look downward, to trace their own footsteps, to become humble before the smallness of things underfoot. In feeling small, people learn to act deliberately. Folklore scholars have often tried to map the Aigamuxa to taxonomies of myth. Some compare it to bogey figures across deserts worldwide, creatures that embody the unseen dangers of night. Others tie it specifically to the Khoikhoi worldview of interconnectedness, where animals, humans and landscape participate in a web of signs each must study. Oral storytellers, with their steady cadence and careful repetition, understood that the more detailed the image, the more effective the lesson. A child who sees the eyes in a tale will wake in the night and look at their feet, making sure their sandals sit within reach. The Aigamuxa is therefore not merely a monster to frighten but a lesson to be internalized, an imaginative device that graduates a person from careless wanderer to cautious traveler. Even the name itself carries a kind of mnemonic weight. Though the etymology is not uniform across all tellings, the sound of the word, clipped, angular, and carrying a slight hiss, works like a talisman when spoken aloud by the elders around a low, careful fire. The syllables fall into the night like pebbles, each one a small instruction. Do not wander alone, secure your fire, listen to what the sand tells you, respect water and the memory it keeps. Over centuries, the Aigamuxa expanded in the popular imagination and then contracted again, shaped by the priorities of each generation, until it became a living ledger of survival strategies for a harsh land. Beyond survival, the origin of the Aigamuxa reflects human anxieties about predation and unfamiliarity. In arid places where people were accustomed to the rhythms of a delicate ecosystem, the arrival of something that turns those rhythms into an instrument of harm is a story that must be told and retold. The Aigamuxa is a monster of inversion. It takes our most basic assumptions and flips them. Eyes where there should be none, a hunter that sees the stories of footprints rather than faces. In this inversion, the people who live near the scorched earth find a metaphor for the unknown and an instruction for humility. To know the desert you must keep your gaze low and your senses open. When colonial explorers and later ethnographers first recorded fragments of the story, they sometimes missed this practical intelligence. They told the Aigamuxa as an exotic monster, a curiosity of belief, without the layered pragmatism embedded in each telling. The elders who kept the tale did not swallow such inaccuracies. They continued to use the Aigamuxa for what it had always been, a living tool for keeping children near the hearth, and experienced elders listened to the ground. In that sense, the legend resists reduction. It remains, to those who understand, a compact of ancestral concern, a narrative compass pointing to the practical and the moral care required to survive and thrive where the earth offers both succor and threat. So the Aigamuxa was born not from an idle imagination but from the hard calculus of life in an environment that demands attention. The eyes on the soles of its feet are an arresting image, yes, but they were never meant purely to startle. They were meant to change behavior. In the hush between dusk and the start of night, when the elders call children close and the stars tilt their watchful faces toward the dunes, the story is told again, and each telling is a small survival lesson made into a work of art. A child grows up with a map of warnings and the quiet knowledge that the land itself can be a vigilant protector and a terrible adversary. The Aigamuxa watches the footprints left by the living and the dead alike, not as a fable of doom alone but as a reminder that in such places, life depends on noticing the smallest of signs. Encounters and lessons. Stories of the Aigamuxa in the night. Stories breathe when they are repeated at the hearth, and the Aigamuxa was one that elders offered often, a fable woven with precise survival tips. These recountings form a kind of oral atlas, places to avoid, times to be especially vigilant, small rituals to enact before sleep. One frequent telling began with a young herder named Garib, a name that could be translated as watchful one, in some dialects, who ignored an elder's advice to bury his sandals near his sleeping mat after a season of triumph. He had spent the day with his goats on a distant plain, his pockets heavy with small rewards and his mind full of the warm glow of belonging. When moonrise suggested the night would be calm, He stretched by his small fire and fell instead into a careless sleep, shoes tossed aside and embers scattered. The story moves slowly in the telling. Elders will emphasize the ordinary, the pipe left unemptied, the laughter of friends, the casual confidence that makes a person vulnerable. Then the listener learns the inevitable, the soundless approach of a long-limbed figure, a subtle blankness in the air that precedes the mark left on the sand. In some tellings, Garib woke to the sensation of weight near his feet, to eyes upon the soles of his sandals, and found his companions gone. In others, the Aigamuxa's presence is known only by the footprint when dawn comes, too large to match any human foot and crowned with an iris glinting like a trapped star. The variations are many, but the kernel is consistent. Neglect your small, sensible acts and you risk meeting what watches from the ground. A night scene of a small camp while a distant silhouette lurks, traces in the sand suggest a slow, patient approach. Another common tale involves a woman named Kitsi who traveled with a baby in a shawl across a long salt pan to fetch water. The elder telling the story would speak of how Kitsi hummed a lullaby and walked with careful rhythm, not leaving her path even when a mirage promised a shorter route. The Aigamuxa prefers the careless and the hurried. The stories insist, it is patient and it hunts by the history of movement, not by sudden violence alone. Kitsi's caution, tying her bundle tight, beating a small stick against the ground to break the silence, avoiding long shadows, became the moral detail that mothers repeated to daughters. In retellings where the Aigamuxa makes itself known, it does so with a quiet dignity. It is not a rampaging beast but an inevitability, a consequence of ignoring the land's grammar. Kitsi earns survival not through the heroics of combat but through adherence to small, sensible practices encoded as ritual. Do not stray, do not sleep with open feet, lay your path in a clean line. There are darker tellings that emphasize moral ambiguity and the complexity of human culpability, too. In one cautionary account, a stranger passes through a village and, in an attempt to outdo local knowledge, boasts that he fears nothing and needs no instruction. That night he leaves his fire burning bright to show off, and the glare draws other eyes besides human ones. The elders describe the morning scene with quiet cruelty, footprints that showed two different origins, one neat and human, the other malformed and bearing the terrible ocular mark. Villagers found the stranger's cloak snagged on a thorn bush, blood dried in a pattern that suggested a scramble. The Aigamuxa, in such stories, is less judgmental than the land itself, which rewards caution and punishes heedlessness. These stories teach not only technique but humility. Arrogance is a danger as real as thirst. As the myths circulated, they accreted small cultural protocols. Travelers were instructed to sleep with one foot tucked beneath the body and the other covered by a blanket, or to lay their sandals inside a small bundle so a light gust could not easily reveal them. Fire tended to be kept low and coaxed to ember rather than blaze, because intense flames both scatter heat and attract attention. Elders insisted on walking with a companion across flats or moving only when the night was young and the moon still low. These were not superstitions so much as adaptive behaviors disguised as myth. The Aigamuxa functions as a story-sized mnemonic device, an arresting narrative beholden to very human needs, to keep children safe, to prevent needless exposure, to encode survival techniques in a memorable and frightening image. Yet the Aigamuxa also has a sorrowful side in the stories, an element that recognizes the predator's role as part of a broader ecology. Some tellings humanize the monster, suggesting it is driven by hunger the way any creature is, or that it once was bound to a certain place and only leaves when human practices change the land. There are narratives in which herders, expanding their ranges or disturbing traditional grazing, inadvertently push the Aigamuxa into new habits. These versions read almost like ecological parables. Change a landscape's patterns and its inhabitants will alter their ways, sometimes with tragic results. In those stories, the Aigamuxa becomes an index of balance. It reacts to mistake and neglect and adapts to human action. When a stream is diverted or a migration route blocked, the monster will follow the altered path of prey. Thus the tale doubles as commentary. Respect the web of life and the invisible consequences of human choices. Many encounters, however, emphasize cunning over force. A seasoned hunter might recognize an Aigamuxa by the way the ground shows two types of print: long, reed-like marks matched with a delicate surety where the creature sets down its feet to read the earth. In these tales, knowledge and experience provide a kind of immunization. An elder can tell where the Aigamuxa has walked by following inconsistencies: a bed of broken bones in a dry riverbed, a line of disturbed lichen, the hush among the scrub that does not belong to wind alone. Storytellers will sometimes include a small riddle or sign to help listeners identify danger. the presence of a particular thorn bush uprooted in a peculiar pattern or an unusual stacking of stones at the edge of a path. Such signs give the myth a practical toolkit. Imagine the eyes of the Aigamuxa as a cipher that can be read, and suddenly the story becomes training as much as entertainment. Finally, some narratives end not with the monster's defeat but with negotiated understanding. An old woman in one tale speaks softly to the Aigamuxa, recognizing it as a creature born from the land's hunger. She offers a piece of salted meat, or in some versions, the left-behind sandals of a child, bargaining for time and safe passage. These endings preserve the complex morality present in many indigenous stories. Not all trouble is meant to be crushed, and sometimes the wise response to danger is not brute force but respect, tribute, and the rearrangement of human habits. The Aigamuxa, then, can also be a mirror. If people treat their environment with care and humility, the land's watchers may be less keen to correct them with violence. Encounter stories are therefore as much about the human heart, greed, pride, humility, as they are about an uncanny corporeal feature. The moral is subtle: the land remembers your acts, and the eyes that watch from the ground keep a ledger.